Hello and welcome to Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. I am your host, Jeff Seltzer. Once again, I'm super excited to have an awesome guest for this week to talk about all sorts of things. But even more than that, I'm super excited that you've all decided to join me on this journey. Anybody who's new to the podcast, first-time listeners, really excited. Thank you so much for finding us. Thank you for investing your time into listening to me rant about whatever I rant about. And for those of you that come back every single week, i.e. Daniel and Marcus, thank you so much. Appreciate it, guys. Really a lot of fun. I think people will continue to like the podcast if they find more topics they like. Go back in time. Again, this is like episode 30 something. So look back, see what else is there. If it's something interests you, go take a look. If nothing interests you, come find me. Let me know what you want to talk about or hear about, and I will record an episode about it. So if you do want to reach out to me, you can check out the podcast on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod. You can check out my personal Instagram at Seltzer77. If you want to reach the show directly via email, you can check out the show at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. For all things Jeff Seltzer, you can always check me out at jeffseltzer.com. Once again, jeffseltzer.com is the official sponsor of Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. Reminder to everybody, we are available on all podcast platforms. We're available via video and audio on both YouTube at Everybody Has a Story Pod, as well as on Spotify. We are available via audio on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, Amazon, Pandora, pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you can find us. We do have a really cool guest this week who has a really cool name, as you probably saw in the show notes. But before getting into Mark this week, I do want to talk about something which is kind of a follow-up from a few weeks ago. So a few weeks ago, I had on my buddies Marcus and Daniel, and we were talking about trading cards, right? Sports cards, wrestling cards, stuff like that. And how nowadays what you can do is if you have a card that you think has some kind of value to it, you can send it off to a company called PSA, and they will grade it. This way, it'll be permanentized in what they call a slab. And you can, when you sell it or if you hold on to it, you know what the value is, what the condition is, right? A PSA 10 is a perfect card. There's nothing better than that. A PSA 5 is not that great, and a PSA 1 is probably about as bad as it could get. So about a month and a half ago, I had sent out a bunch of cards to get graded, mostly wrestling cards, a couple of soccer cards for my buddy Daniel, but mostly wrestling cards for myself. One of the cards was, I thought, a really cool 1 of 25 John Cena cards. Really cool. And in looking at it, I thought it looked really great. So sent it to PSA, came back today. It was a PSA 5, which totally blew my mind. Like looking at it, I don't see any faults, any issues, or whatever else like that with it. So this card really annoyed me and how they graded it. I do wonder, I guess, how PSA actually grades. Like, is there a consistent methodology and system or computer that grades for them, or is it an employee who kind of looks at it and says, hey, I think it's a 5? So I did what any normal person would do when I got it back as a PSA 5. I went out, bought myself a pair of wire cutters. I got a screwdriver, popped it open, put it back into a hard plastic, and now it is an ungraded John Cena 1 out of 25. So unless you're listening to this podcast, you have no idea that this is only a PSA 5, because if you look at it, I think it's a PSA 8, 9, or 10. And hopefully one day when I try to sell it, if I do, it'll look like that. But again, I got a number of cards back. That was a 5. I got a couple of 6s, which also upset me. But I did get some 9s and 10s. So I do wonder, I guess, what it's based on. I mean, again, the PSA 5 looked much better than the PSA 10. But as Marcus would tell me, there's other things to look for in terms of how the autograph is, if it's on sticker or if it's off sticker, if it's centered, how it comes off the printing press, stuff like that. So I don't know. At some point, I'll figure it out. But what I will say, though, is getting a PSA 5 on a card that I think looks great does make me kind of question sending out valuable cards to PSA. So as an example, a few weeks ago, I actually, in a card break, similar to what Marcus does, I did hit a fairly valuable Stone Cold Steve Austin out of 10 card. So what this basically meant was I got a card in the break, which is autographed by Stone Cold Steve Austin, and its number is something 1 to 10 out of 10. It should be coming in the next week or so. My initial thought was, hey, this sounds great. Let's get it slabbed and graded. But now that I'm seeing that the grading could be potentially all over the place, and again, my eyes aren't great. I have cheaters, but I mean, they work sometimes for me. I still have trouble looking at things. I don't know. It's probably not worth grading. I'll probably just kind of, put it in a plastic, and maybe it'll be easier to sell or kind of live with ungraded. So we'll see. In any event, if you're still listening to the podcast, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. With that said, I did want to invite my guest for this week onto the podcast. So he is not a tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. He also might look like him, but is not one of the Kelsey brothers. I do want to introduce my good friend, Mark Andrews. Mark, how are you today?
Good, good, Jeff. Thank you for introducing me. Thank you for having me on the show.
Of course, awesome. So I appreciate you coming on. So for those that don't know, as most people probably don't, I know Mark Andrews through work. I did not meet him at a Baltimore Ravens game. I did not meet him outside. Uh, Basically, I met him through work on what the topic is for today, which is technology. But before we get into the topic, I did want to give Mark an opportunity to introduce himself and tell the listening audience a little bit about who is Mark Andrews.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, my name's Mark Andrews. I was born and raised in Hillsborough, New Jersey. I like to say smack in the direct middle of New Jersey, but that's a very large debate. I was a baseball player all of my life, and I transitioned from working in the finance industry as an asset manager into really finding my passion in digital marketing. So I've been working in digital marketing for about 10 years. I decided in 2021 that AI was going to take my job. So I went and got a degree in data science. And, now I live on a small farm in New Jersey. I have 3 kids under the age of 5. I'm in a great marriage. And yeah, life is crazy. Life is crazy.
That's a lot. So I mean, as most people know who listen to the show, I do have 2 daughters, but both are teenagers, right? And obviously, having teenagers is, let's say, has its challenges at times. I mean, they're self-sufficient and they're definitely, it's an amazing, let's say, point in life. You're currently living through a life stage where you have 2, or as you said, 3 kids under the age of 5, which I can't even fathom, right? So first of all, having 3 kids under the age of 5 feels like a lot. But secondly, I mean, going from 2 kids to 3 kids is going from like man to man to like zone defense, right? So at any point, you and your wife probably have to split up, or one person takes 2 kids, one person takes 1 kid. It feels like a lot. So before getting to the topic, just curious on, like, I guess, is it as chaotic as it feels or sounds, or you guys have a good system down, so you're kind of in a good place?
It is chaotic, but we work together really well as a team. My wife is a doctor, so she does work quite long hours. So a lot of times, we have to kind of fill out those gaps and figure out, how to run that zone-to-zone defense.
Of
But at
course.
the end of the day, both of us love it. Like it's one of those areas where like our home is our happy place, and it becomes easier over time. And I'm constantly reminded by older friends, we're basically like, you have to cherish these years, like really, really enjoy them. So I've been really living into that.
Awesome. Well, it's great to hear. I mean, obviously every life stage has its own pluses and minuses. I do at times, kind of miss some of the life stages from when kids were younger, but at the same time, as a contrast, I do love the life stage I'm in right now. Like on Saturday, I'm taking one of my daughters to a Devils game. Later this year, I'm taking one of them to see Linkin Park in concert. So it's like it's different life stages, different things you can enjoy with them, right? At your age or your kid's age is probably a lot of going to events because they enjoy it and kind of watching them have a good time. But then as you get older, it becomes, what kinds of things can you guys have in common to enjoy together? So I mean, we all evolve, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny talking about trading cards because, ever since I was a kid, growing up in the 90s, I was a huge Pokemon fan. So I've been trying to foray some of that passion and kind of like shed that along to my kids. And I kind of had this epiphany like, okay, it's a little bit too early, like the idea that this, nice card gets bent and destroyed, it brings back like this little bit of like concern from my childhood where I saw some Charizard that some kid pulled out of his pocket with peanut butter all over his fingers. So it's funny because I'm realizing, what I can and cannot do at this age.
Totally get it. And we'll get into that in a short time. But first, I wanted to make sure I didn't lose my audience yet with the topic that we have for this week, which is technology. So you had mentioned in your intro that you originally worked in finance and you eventually got an additional degree in technology and transitioned over. So let's take a step back and let me ask you this. Like, how did you get into finance? What was it that kind of pulled you in there? And then eventually what made you decide, finance ain't for me?
That's a really good question. In high school, I was kind of undecided of what I wanted to do, but I was really understanding that I was good at math. It was kind of my passion. It was the area that I was excelling in. And I kind of figured, hey, if you're good at math, you can make money in finance. So, it might have been like a shallow assumption at the time, but that's kind of how I was perceiving, seeing other people I knew and other families and thought, oh, you can make a lot of money in finance. Once I finally got to college, I actually got a really poor GPA because I was really distracted with athletics. I had a difficult time managing a lot of those things. But I graduated and I basically took a role at New York Life at the time. This is, many, many years ago. And what I had realized was that it was this unsexy angle of selling insurance and also managing mutual funds, but was also like this very high level of commission. And it was kind of a struggle where you really had to be out there kind of like really talking to family members, friends, doing these things. And I really tried for 4 years to do this. I really gave it my all. What I had always enjoyed about all of this was the data, right? Like coming from being a baseball player, the best 9 people on the field, reading Moneyball, you learn about how data drives all these decisions. I had this epiphany that the stock market was out of my control. I wanted to do something more manageable, a little bit more, I guess, predictable, if you will. And I basically, after, I think it was in my mid-20s, said, you know what, I'm completely resigning, leaving this field. I'm going to move back with my parents for a few months and try to get a new entry-level role in something I enjoy. So it was kind of a passion evolution, if you will.
Got it. And I guess at that point, you were kind of like, hey, what can I do? You said the statistics, technology, and stuff like that. Is that when you went back, got your additional degree, and then kind of fell into a tech kind of a job?
That was actually when I started working for a tech research company. And what I was actually doing was digital marketing. So
Okay.
I was actually working through launching a lot of Google ads and a lot of paid search ads to essentially drive that business. And throughout that experience, I basically learned in digital marketing what is called CRO, which is conversion rate optimization, which is like this very sequential and tenuous process where you're peeling back these layers to find out how much it costs someone to register across any keyword, right? So I started to really learn and appreciate that data. And it makes a lot of sense. I think that's the beauty of digital marketing data is it's all logical. So I really was able to lean into that. And I kind of forayed from a sales and marketing role into more of kind of like a digital marketing technology role over time, just by really focusing on those hands-on aspects, if you will.
So it's funny you say that. So like for me, again, I'm 47 years old. I've been in corporate America for about 25 years at this point, almost, I guess, 26 years at this point. I've kind of, throughout most of my career, I've done pretty well, but at the same time, I'd never really found what I'd liked. So I tried lots of different things. So like out of college, I worked in market research. I worked in customer analytics. I did all sorts of different things. The role that I'm in right now is kind of a best of, which is interesting in the fact that it kind of takes all the different perspectives and roles that I've done and brings it together. Taking a step back, like in high school, I was always good at math, but not really as good in English. Largely because for me, I look at it and I say, okay, if you give me any kind of a math problem, I can kind of, using logic, back my way into figuring out how to solve it. On the flip side, from an English perspective or language perspective, like the logic doesn't always hold. So for me, like the SATs, for example, I did super well on the math side and I did good enough on the English side, which, or verbal side, which got me to where I needed to get to for college. Also growing up, I was always told that I was really good at computers, which in hindsight, I don't know that I really was, but I was told that. So I decided freshman year, I was going to potentially be a computer science major, which was great until about week 2 of class. And I had no clue what was going on. Like I was surrounded by all these geniuses and I knew how to turn a computer on. So like, I don't know that I was quite where I needed to be or whatever. So I kind of like, I did well enough to graduate college, went to, Rutgers, which wasn't too far from where we grew up. And then eventually fell into my career. And then years later, I'm where I am right now, which again, I'm excited to be where I am right now. I'm happy about it. But it took me a long time. Like on the flip side, like one of the roles that I had in my career was I worked in sales. So I worked for a major, let's say CPG or consumer packaged goods company. And I wanted to develop myself and get a sales opportunity. The challenge that I had was it was a lot less on data and analytics, and it was more so on relationship. Being, I guess, the natural introvert that I am, relationships didn't necessarily come naturally to me, and oftentimes kind of annoy me in terms of like what you have to do to kind of like maintain them, specifically in like a one-sided relationship with like, with a buyer, let's say at a retailer. So it wasn't really something I enjoyed. And then I eventually found myself back on the data side as I am a natural data geek. So it kind of worked out how it is. So like for me, that's kind of how it's worked. But for you, it sounds like also, again, you work through finance, you found something you liked, and you've gotten really good at technology jobs, got the degree, and kind of put you to where you are today, which is great. I mean, again, on a side note, I think my late 20s, I at one point decided, you know what, I think I want to quit what I'm doing, go back to school and become a teacher. I never did because I was like, okay, so if I quit my job and get another degree, am I really ever going to be happy professionally as a teacher? I have no idea. My sister's a teacher. She seems happy enough. I don't know that it would have necessarily been what I was looking for, but we all hopefully find what we're looking for at some point, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? I think To me, it was very similar to where like I had never thought that I would be able to do Python or R, be able to do some coding and machine learning to actually develop models. And it was really like this opportunity where my wife said to me, like, listen, why don't you just apply for a few separate degrees, look at a couple of universities that have this master's degree in applied data science, just apply, see if you get in, and then just take the leap of faith. Like, what do you have to lose? And what I had started to realize was a lot of these things, I've started to see this parallel between video games, right? Like you use these technical systems, you go onto a website. It's meshing more so based on the focus of UX and design towards how video games are and menus in video games. So that's when I started realizing like, wow, I can get really into this. This is something I can just stick my head down and get really passionate about. But also it had that interactive type approach where it's like, oh, if it works, and if it doesn't work, you immediately know. So you can move on to the next thing. So I think that immediate validation helped me dispel some of those fears.
Nice. So professionally, obviously you're in technology, you've done a lot of work with like AI and various things like that. Do you find in your personal life you're heavy into technology as well? Like would you consider yourself like an early adapter from technology? Do you always have to get the new like phone? Like how would you kind of rate your interest level, I'd say personally from a tech perspective?
For me, I'm really interested in new technology that has usable and like utilitarian AI. Like I have these Meta glasses that I bought a couple months ago and I cannot get them off my head. Like stupid questions, random facts. Like me and my wife were watching a Korean movie and there was a sign and I could translate it.
Oh, wow.
And I've just started to get very used to them. I've started to appreciate them. With phones, I'm not always about the newest phone just because I know like that newest technology isn't something I'm going to always use, if you will, like the newest camera. But for the most part, yeah, like when ChatGPT first came out, when Midjourney came out, all these models, I started really learning about them and I started seeing a lot of these cool opportunities. And, it's actually when I started to develop some of these use cases that were really interesting. And, in the end of the day, you're just working in like these crazy abstract images. So people didn't take it as seriously when it first came out, I'd say in like the end of 2023-ish.
Yeah. Totally makes sense. Totally agree. So like from a personal tech perspective, so you'd say like the Meta glasses you have on now. So like I've vaguely heard about them, but I'm not that familiar. You said, so it can kind of like see something and translate it for you like in your eyes, or like kind of like how do these Meta glasses work for you and kind of like what's the usability function?
For sure. So if you see here, on each of my fingers is a little camera. And on the top of my pointer finger here is a button. And what happens is you can take pictures or take videos. So like if you're driving or doing something or playing with your kids, you could just kind of quickly snap a photo or a video, which is cool. But there's actually a chip in here that has a small little AI output device where once you take a picture, it can analyze the picture, put it through kind of the Meta AI decision-making model, and it will actually repeat. So it will do translations. If you're talking to someone, you can say, hey, please record this person's voice and translate it. It does kind of numerous different things. You could look at like some weird animal. You don't know what it is. It could be some weird butterfly, and it'll tell you what it is based on the image search. It works pretty well, actually. It works better than I thought it would.
And are those prescription glasses, I assume?
No, these are blue light glasses.
Okay.
I've been looking at it. I look at a screen like 12 to 16 hours a day. So I've started to just realize that I need to save my eyes a bit.
It's interesting. I do wonder, I mean, first of all, it sounds really awesome. And it sounds like you're getting some good use out of those glasses. But I do wonder, like professionally, like at some point, will we kind of like, how does that work if we go into like a work environment? Like, so for example, you've got those glasses and in theory, you can take pictures or video. If I walked into work with like, a camera and started taking video and pictures of everything, at some point security or someone would like knock me down. Like maybe not physically, but like, figuratively, they'd say, stop that. Don't take video of this. Mm-hmm. Like, I would imagine, I'd wonder from a privacy perspective, like how that goes, or at some point, do companies kind of like kibosh it or kind of like how that goes,
Yeah, it's a good question. Like there is this thing called the privacy light. So like if I hit record here, you're going to see a little light go on.
Right.
And that's to alert people that like, hey, you're recording, right? What you're supposed to do is ask for everyone's permission. Like, hey, is it okay if I record this? Which is obviously impossible in some circumstances. Right. But I totally agree, right? Like you could be essentially a spy and you can just, have a visitor's pass to some large conglomerate. And you can just go around taking pictures and rooms and stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, or even something like, years ago, if you found a bootleg movie, sometimes it was somebody who brought a huge video camera like into a movie theater. Right, like with something like this, in theory, you could walk into a movie, sit there, hit record, and you can record the movie, right?
Yeah, theoretically, right? Like it might be like low quality, right? Like there's going to
Sure.
be some things, but yeah, absolutely.
And I'd imagine, I mean, like, these are Meta glasses, and this is probably like generation one or two. Like, I'd imagine, like, the level of quality gets to, let's say, 5, 10 years from now, it'll probably be 4K or 8K or whatever that looks like. And you can probably
Oh.
even live stream it, and that just becomes a whole other thing altogether. So I'm curious to see where technology goes and kind of like what the universe looks like, a decade from now.
Yeah, yeah, and you know what? I think the next stage of this is essentially having like a screen that projects like a little like map or like a little piece of text in front of your face that only you can see, like this augmented reality
Yeah,
element
kind of
to
like
it.
I mean, maybe it's the same thing, but kind of like the Apple Vision glasses or something like that. Similar kind of a thing where, like, you're wearing it and you can kind of see what's around you, but at the same time, you could also see a movie or you can see whatever apps you're working on and stuff like that. So, I mean, I don't know how high tech your glasses are, but I'd imagine like eventually it'll probably all have that kind of function to it.
Yeah, yeah. Then it's like, well, we even need phones at that point. Like, is Apple gonna have to get ahead of this before somebody else does?
I mean, to that point, it's funny how technology works, right? So, I got my first cell phone back in 1998, and like it was a bit of a brick phone. And then basically the next, I want to say, decade, cell phones got smaller and smaller and smaller until all of a sudden smartphones came out and got big, and then they started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So like the cell phone I had back in like 2007, 2008 was tiny. Then all of a sudden these tablets and these screen phones came out, started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, for me, especially at my age now and with my reading issues, I guess from an eyesight perspective, like I always go for like the Pro Max because like the bigger the screen, the better, the bigger the font, the better. But it's just interesting to see over the last like 25 years just how much it's evolved in one direction and then evolved in the other direction.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm actually the opposite. I like the smaller phones. Like
Okay.
I liked them when they were tinier. If I could have like a little Derek Zoolander phone, I totally
That's pretty crazy.
would.
So I mean, obviously your glasses are really cool. Like, what would you say is like your favorite piece of technology that you have like in your house, or that like when you bought it, you're like the most excited to get it?
That's a good question. I would probably say either my computer, these glasses, or my car.
Okay,
I can look at all three as like technical technology, but I probably use my gaming computer the most.
nice.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Does your wife have a similar love or fascination with technology, or is she kind of on the other end of the spectrum here?
She does not. She's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Like she wears an Apple Watch. Like she still definitely like has like an updated phone, and has to use different PCs and computers for work all the time, but not to the degree that I am. Like I'm constantly telling her about new crap that she just does not care about at all.
I get a similar response too. Oftentimes, like I'll get something, or I'll be like, "Hey, I want to get this," or "I think it's cool," and my wife's like, "Then just go get it." But like not with like a lot of enthusiasm. Like that looks really awesome. Just kind of like, well, if it makes you happy, then go do it. But whatever. Or like I guess I'm more of an early adapter than my wife is also. So like when the Apple Watch first came out in 2015, like the first time they came out, I bought one. It took about I want to say like a year or so of like her seeing it, and I think she actually went on a trip and saw somebody else with it. That she was like, you know what, I should get an Apple Watch as well. Versus for me, I don't know what it is. Like the new technology always just fascinates me, and like I'd love to kind of be in the ground floor and try it. Obviously, understanding that there's going to be issues initially, which then frustrate me as well. But at least to kind of like play with it and like, wow, this is the future only to see like a year or two later the future is even better than that future.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? I think we're in this weird era where, like, as humans, we had this long cycle of new technology, right?
Right.
Look at cell phones as they evolve, the internet. You look at computational power from PCs. A lot of these different things, and I think it's at the point now where the last 3, 4, 5 years have moved way faster than consumers can actually keep up. And I think it's interesting because even looking at ChatGPT, right? DeepSeek just launched like 2 weeks ago, huge disruptor. We had Grok launched 2 days ago from X. And we're in this stage where, guess what? They're making spaceships and they're making Ferraris that can go 400 miles an hour. But
Right.
your average consumer is still in the go-kart stage, right? And
Right.
it's when does the, I guess, complexity of the speed of AI development actually catch up to everyone using it and figuring it out and actually it becoming an everyday tool?
Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, I also think about it too, right? So people talk about how like the stock market has grown so much over the last few years, things like that. But I also look at it like to your point from before about like technology kind of like speeding up and like AI helping things out and stuff like that. Like the amount of productivity in most companies has increased so much over the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years because of technology that like I'm curious to see kind of like what the end game is here, right? Because at some point you would think that you would almost like max out on productivity or something would happen, especially, I mean, working for like a consumer packaged goods company where like, okay, great. So we can innovate, we can create stuff faster, but at the end of the day, if the consumer isn't ready for it or if they don't fully understand it, like, eventually it's kind of a hurry up and wait. You make it, you innovate it, but then if they're not ready for it yet, you have to take them on the journey. I mean, here's an example. Like 15 years ago or 14, whatever it was, when the iPad first launched, I think I guess either Jobs or Cook, whoever was in charge at the time, was like, okay, from a research perspective, they have to put out products that consumers don't realize they need yet. So when I first saw the iPad, I was like, that looks really dumb. It's just a big iPhone. Like, why do I need an iPad? A year later, I bought one, and here we are years later. I couldn't see my life without it. Like, it's completely changed the way that I live my life, and the fact that, like, instead of having like my own laptop at home, I have an iPad, which basically acts like a laptop. When I travel, I don't travel anywhere without the iPad. When I get on a plane, I sit there and watch a movie for 2 hours. Anywhere I go, I have the iPad because it's almost like my life with me. But like again, years ago, I was like, I don't need that. I have my iPhone. That should be good enough. So it's crazy because again, if I sat in a focus group with Apple employees and they said, "What do you think about this?" I would be like, "It's dumb," but they launched it, and the iPad is really not just taken over the world, but kind of it's innovated and it's created a category that really didn't exist before then.
Yeah, it's very true, right? And it was such a different design than like your traditional type of laptop, and the clunky mouse and the big keyboard and all of that technical debt that you had to carry along with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a huge game changer, and it's interesting to see that those evolutions too. And you saw all of the other companies try to piggyback, and they made their spin-offs. But
I mean, even Microsoft like has a big sponsorship with the NFL, but like the Surface tablet hasn't really taken off. I mean, if you're talking tablets, most of the time you're talking iPads.
Yeah, and it's funny, like when I look at like the analytics of a website, right? Like a lot of the times I look at devices and I look at like what type of devices are they using at what times of the day.
Yeah.
And you can catch those late nighters in their bed on their iPad, and you catch those people in the working hours 9 to 5 on their PC. It's interesting.
I mean, I say similarly, and this is kind of, I guess, for me at least, intriguing from a data perspective. So this specific podcast, like I get all sorts of data in terms of like what platform people listen to or watch it on, what country, stuff like that. And as much as I try to push people to Spotify, largely because Spotify is really where this podcast is hosted from, and then most of the data, Spotify gives better data versus if it goes to Apple or somewhere else like that. I mean, I'll still get data for who listens or people listening elsewhere, but Spotify gives me the most data. So even though I'm trying to push people to Spotify, I still get over 50% of my listens or streams from Apple. I think to that point from before, largely because like it's the ecosystem, right? You've got the iPads, the iPhones, the Macs. And the great thing about like the iPads and all these devices is they all sync so well together. So like if I start something on my iPad, I can go to my iPhone and I can finish it, or go to my Mac and I can easily transfer the file over. Like it just works so seamlessly, which is crazy. But from a user experience, it's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you're kind of describing like this like Trojan horse marketing approach, right? Where it's like if you buy a new PC, guess what? You're probably going to use Explorer, right? Or you're going to use Edge.
Yes.
Like if you're a millennial, you might download Chrome. If you're a Gen Zer, you might download Chrome. Gen Xer might download Chrome,
Yep.
And when you have these different types of tech companies that install these things, it's almost like they can filter more people to them becoming clients.
Sure.
Similar like Copilot, right? When you look at Copilot and you look at all the companies that have their data on Azure, it's like that's kind of a long-term play. They're just trying to get you to use some AI on top of your data. But it's super common now because the big players are able to eat up and kind of push out some of the smaller players because they're forcing them throughout their suite of technology.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of Copilot, like again, going with the different devices again, like I have a Office 365 subscription for personal. So the great thing about it is I pay, one price per year, and I can get, Excel, Word, and PowerPoint on my Mac, my iPad, and my iPhone. Versus if I had like, let's say a PC, it might be separate subscriptions, or it's a little different, or you really can't get it across all devices. So again, like just the way the Mac works, it just works. And for me personally, it just works so easily and seamlessly across devices.
Yeah, definitely. It's the best. It's like the best experience, right?
It is. I remember years ago, like when I buy a PC, we buy a CD-ROM. You had to install it into one computer, and then you had to kind of do something and something and something, but it didn't quite work the same. Versus now, it's just same thing with like Quicken or whatever else like that. Any software that I get, easily works for like one subscription price across all my devices.
Yeah, and you know what's funny is when I finally had the epiphany that the CD-ROM era days were dead when I bought like a gaming PC in like 2015, and it didn't even have a disk drive, and I was like, oh my god.
Well, okay, can I tell you a quick story in terms of what I think should have been the death of the CD-ROM?
Yes.
So back in 2002, so my wife now, my girlfriend at the time, she had a PC computer with a built-in CD-ROM drive. So remember, we're still on dial-up at the time. We weren't on like high speed or Wi-Fi and stuff like that. So the PC had a CD-ROM drive, and the CD-ROM drive died. Now, back then, you needed a CD-ROM drive because anytime you got something new, you needed CD. I mean, the old floppy disk didn't have enough space, so you had to have a CD drive. So went to Best Buy, bought a new external CD-ROM drive, which in theory sounded great. The challenge was to install the new CD-ROM drive, you needed to use a CD. So here lies the issue. The reason she got a new CD-ROM drive was because her current CD-ROM drive didn't work, but you needed the CD to install the firmware or the software. So inevitably, this new CD-ROM drive just would never work because she couldn't install the software. I mean, nowadays you probably download the software from the manufacturer's website or whatever, but back then you just couldn't do it. So that led her to eventually just buying a new computer. It's just really weird how like it just didn't make any logical sense. Kind of like a couple years after that. So back, 25, 20 years ago, people who owned PCs would usually buy an antivirus software, right? So you'd buy like McAfee or Norton or something like that. So one of my coworkers at the time, I guess they didn't realize they already had an antivirus software. So they bought another antivirus software and tried to install it, but it crashed the computer because both antivirus softwares kept trying to fight each other. So basically, she probably had Norton already installed. She tried installing McAfee. Norton thinks that McAfee's trying to take over the computer. McAfee's just trying to do its job and protect the computer. So it basically became like a World War computer of some kind between the two. And the computer was like, you know what, I'm done. It's just nuts how technology works sometimes. I like to think that we've kind of evolved beyond that, but I mean, nothing surprises me anymore with technology,
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, and you know what? You remind us of a simpler time when like you would see a little pop-up, and if you clicked on that pop-up, your whole PC could explode within like 2 days, right? I remember that era where every single thing you had to do on a PC, you had to do in such a way where you don't click on the wrong thing by accident, right?
Right.
And you had all these pop-up blockers, you had Norton, you had McAfee, you had all these things. And you almost like don't even remember those anymore, right? Like those are like gone pieces of technology that you don't really think about. They're so built into the system these days. But I remember like one of the funniest things me and my friends used to do was in middle school, early 2000s. And we would go into these computer labs, and there was like these big kind of like the off-shell white computers with the giant desktops and the big white screens.
Yep.
And me and my friends used to think the funniest thing was to go to like miniclip.com or I think it was like eBombs World. We would like play the little games on those sites.
Yeah.
And then there'd be a pop-up. And I would yell, "Oh my God, I just won a free iPad." And I would start clicking on it, and the teacher would run over and they'd be like, "No, don't do that." And then everyone would start joking. And, looking back, it's like, oh, we were just like destroying these school computers. Like we were just imploding them with viruses. And we thought it was hilarious.
So on a similar note, and again, I'm a few years older than you are, so let me date myself a little bit. So I grew up in Edison, New Jersey, and back in the 80s and 90s, there was a place called Tops Appliance Center. Basically, it was, I don't know, there's not really I guess it was like an old school Best Buy before Best Buy for the most part. They had anything you could think of, like house appliances, they had computers, they had games, all sorts of stuff. It was like a half mile from my house. And me and my buddy would always bike over there and just kind of like look at the stuff and whatever. I remember we bought something at one point and the return policy was just awful. Like it wasn't good. You couldn't return things for whatever. So they had a bunch of computers on display. So we would, this is back when you used to use screensavers that you could either put pictures on or like scrolling text. So we would every day go in there and adjust the screensaver to say, ask us about a return policy. So what would happen is, we'd have one employee halfway across the store. We probably put on like 24 computers, ask us about a return policy. Obviously trying to advertise something they probably don't want to talk about. Eventually, I think we got chased out of the store or whatever because they weren't too thrilled with it. And I think they eventually put password protection on the screensaver as well. But, this is what teenage kids who have nothing better to do I guess, do to try to get their the revenge on stores like this,
This is a forgotten art, like I hope that in years time, this is documented, like these funny little silly tricks we used to play on each other. It just doesn't happen anymore. Like one of the funny ones we used to do in college was like, you would go to a friend's computer if they left it open and you would change their profile pic or post something super embarrassing. The funniest thing though was a little bit even more complex than that, and this is really funny. So what we used to do, and my friend Jay told us this, and we actually got him with it the worst, but back in the day when someone would leave their Facebook up, you could change their birthday. And what we used to do is change their birthday to like a day in a few days, right? Just some random day.
Right.
And on that day, all of their friends would comment like, "Oh, hey, happy birthday, Jeff. Happy birthday. Hope you have a good one." And we did this to my friend Jason.
Right.
So he got the comments and, he thought it was, we all thought it was so funny, and he got so upset. We're like, "Hey man, like, it was just a joke. We're sorry. Like, why are you so upset?" And he's like, "My grandma forgot my birthday and she wrote on my wall and she knows my birthday." And he was so upset at that fact. I was like, "Oh man, I do feel kind of bad now."
That's crazy. So I don't know that you can even change your birthday on Facebook anymore. Like, this is probably years ago, because I think now it's more locked or such, right?
Yeah, this is like 20 years ago, or maybe even like 15.
Yeah,
you can't do that kind of stuff anymore.
No, I guess not. It's crazy. I mean, I would say, little shenanigans like that don't really exist, but I'm sure new shenanigans are there that, like, you'll hear about from your kids when they're in school or whatever. It just kind of evolves, and kids will be kids, right? Everyone finds something to do to kind of like, mess around with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just fun to do it with technology.
It is. So earlier you had mentioned that you were a Division I athlete and you played baseball in college. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience? Would love to hear about, like, I guess, did you get recruited? Were you on scholarship? Like, how did that whole thing work out? And, like, at what point did you have to decide, you know what, I'm not doing baseball anymore because maybe, whatever?
Absolutely. So, I grew up in Hillsborough High School, and, in New Jersey, high school baseball is super duper competitive. You have kind of Texas, California, New York, Florida, and, Jersey was always one of like the top 7 or 8. So when I played at Hillsborough, we had a really good team where we would top 10 in the state, usually every year or every other year. And we had a couple of really big powerhouse players. At the time, I think I went my senior year like 8-1 with like a 1.9 ERA.
Oh, wow.
And I was first team all conference, like first team all. I wasn't first team all state. I was like honorable mention all state, and then I think I was like second team all county. Okay. And basically, when you're at that level, what I would do is I would go to these showcases to where I would pitch to a handful of guys, and, different coaches would see you and then get your information and reach out. So over time, I started getting calls from like Connecticut, Central Connecticut, Fairleigh Dickinson, Sacred Heart, Holy Cross, a lot of schools up in New England, because I was playing in a few tournaments up there. And, I got a call from the school, Bryant University. And, basically they said, "Hey, we're doing this tryout. There's going to be 200 kids there, 250 kids. Why don't you come out and try out? There's going to be about 15, 20 other colleges there."
Nice.
So I said, "Great. Yeah, I'll be there." And I faced 14 batters. I think I struck out 9 of them. And then I think I had 5 ground outs. And basically the coach came up to me and afterwards and was like, "Hey, I want to bring you on for an official visit. I'd like to like actually extend you a scholarship offer." Wow. And then a bunch of other coaches called me because I was just outstanding that outing, right? That was like really my big performance, where I was able to take what I learned in New Jersey and go apply it in another state where there was a bigger skill gap, if you will.
Did you realize how good you were, like, going into that, or did like your performance surprise you that day?
I kind of knew it. I was always a bit of like a Greg Maddux. Like, I was never throwing 85, 88. I was always throwing 82 to 84. Okay. But I could pinpoint the ball exactly where I wanted to.
So your accuracy, you didn't necessarily have the speed, but your accuracy was perfect.
Yeah. Like in a lot of my college years, as I would have 30, 40, 50 innings sometimes, and only a handful of walks. Okay. I was really, really high KK to walk ratio.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. So then obviously you got recruited, you took a scholarship, and you played ball in college. How did that experience go? So obviously, going to school on scholarship and playing a sport, but also trying to, get your schooling done or whatever. Like, how do you do one versus the other? Like, how do you make it through? And like, at what point do you look at it and say, baseball was fun, but now I got to get a real job now that college is over? Or do you decide, hey, I want to get drafted or try to get, the next level?
Absolutely. So it's very much like a part-time job. You know, if you think about your standard Division One athlete, what we would have is basically blocks of time where we had mandatory lifting, running, or swimming, and then blocks of time where we had mandatory class, and then blocks of time for practice.
Right.
So a typical day is 5:30, 6 a.m., either at the track in the weight room for an hour, hour and a half, class from essentially 8 a.m. to noon, and then practice on the field from 1 to 5. And then it was study hall, usually an hour a night. So from like 6 to 7, if you will, after dinner, or 7 to 8.
Gotcha.
And you got into this schedule to where it becomes this routine that you get very used to. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, it becomes difficult as the demands of education go up, and you have all these practices, your body's tired, like you don't want to have to go to the library all night after you've been beating your body up.
Right.
So that was an interesting part of it, but I honestly loved it. Like I went into college, I was about 165 pounds after all the lifting. After I ended at about 188, so I bulked up a lot. I was able to really get in great shape. I started throwing in the upper 80s, and I started doing really well. My sophomore year was really when I started becoming the closer. I had 10 saves. That was when I stepped up, and we played a lot of really good schools then.
And then, remind me again, I don't think I asked, what school did you go to?
Bryant University up in Rhode Island.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then, my biggest year was my junior year, where I basically, I got first team all region in the Northeast region. I got first team all conference. I was a mid-season honorable mention All-American. And that kind of was my year where I was like, oh, wow, I could actually maybe do this at a little bit higher level. Probably not, but it gave me that hope.
Did you actually have that opportunity, or did it not really present itself to go to the next level?
That's a good question. A lot of people are presented with this opportunity to say, hey, you're kind of one of three players. Either A, you're just not going to make it.
Right.
B, you're on the cusp and you're going to have to get either really lucky, or you're going to have to work incredibly hard to maybe get a shot. Or C, you're going to get kind of like the expedited shot and you're going to get drafted and they're going to bring you right into the farm system.
Of course.
So I was part of that B bucket.
Which is probably the toughest spot to be, right? Because if you're in the bottom bucket, you're like, well, I had fun, but you don't really have any false hope, right? The top bucket, you're like, I'm a sure thing. But in this one, you've got some personal decisions to make. Like, do I want to really invest in myself, my time? There's obviously a risk there. And at the same time, there's so many more unknowns, right?
Yeah. And, I had this epiphany that I was like, some sidearm slinging lefty, only throwing in the mid 80s. It would kind of take me a miracle to make it there. Right. So I had started interviewing before my senior year was up, and I had started to go onto job interviews and align that. At the very end of my senior year, my coach came to me at the time, Steve Owens. He's actually now the head baseball coach at Rutgers. Oh, wow. And he says, Mark, I got a phone call from the Diamondbacks and the Reds. They want to bring you out to their camp in California. If you're willing to go, get you out there. I know the guys there. And I just said, what, coach, I think I'm over it. I think it's time to go into the real world. I have a lot of friends who really, I want to say, got drunk on that idea of actually thinking that it's going to be years and years of beating yourself with that end all goal. Right. And I just had to be realistic, right? I'm a man of numbers in the end of the day, and it just wasn't making sense.
I mean, that's a really mature perspective, right? Because a lot of people would still have the fantasy of like, hey, I could still do it. The dream is still here, whatever. So, I mean, it must have been tough also, because at that point, you've probably played baseball your whole life. And I've got to accept the fact that, okay, at this point, I've got to move on to the next point in my life. Baseball was fun, but now I have to, move into reality of what is next. Like, was there a lot of soul searching, or was it kind of an easy decision for you at that point?
There was some soul searching, and at the end of my summer, I want to say in 2011, I had a chance to play in another All-Star game for that same kind of all-region area. Right. And during that All-Star game, this was at Lowell Spinner Stadium at the time, I struck out one of like the top Division III players in the country, and with that pitch, I threw a slider. I heard a pop in my shoulder.
Oh no!
I went and got an MRI, went and saw the doctor in New York, and basically found out I had a posterior torn labrum with a partial tear.
Yeah.
And that's when I said, okay, great. It's made the decision for me.
I mean, it's tough, but I guess it's probably the universe saying, okay, Mark, you've had a good run. But at this point, I mean, if even before you finish college, your body's already starting to kind of fall apart, like how long of a career would you even have if you made it to the next level, right?
And I look at pitchers from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I see some of the pitch counts for games where they were throwing 170, 180 pitches.
Crazy.
And I remember in high school a couple games where I threw 140, 150, and it is severe pain. You know, your arm barely feels like it's hanging on.
Right.
And I get it now how so many baseball players over the years are so prone to injury.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's insane.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for sharing that story. It's really interesting. So for me, I mean, I played some baseball growing up. I was never a great athlete. I kind of did it to have fun, whatever else like that. So it's always interesting to me to hear kind of the perspective and the experience of somebody who, you know, made it that far. I mean, the fact that you played Division I in college is incredible. Basically, you were on the cusp. But again, like you said, you kind of made the mature decision, or your body made it for you, that, you know, hey, this was great. Let's do something else at this point. So again, thank you for sharing that, Mark. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting because looking back on it, one of the things I've learned is it's not realistic to look at everything as a competitive athletic world, right? Yeah. I was trained and conditioned that the best 9 people are on that field. Right. And it was an epiphany for me to like get into the real world and recognize that that's not how the world works.
No, I mean, it's funny. So for me, like I said before, like I look at myself more as a completist versus a competist. So I played baseball when I was younger. I played some like roller hockey, stuff like that. But like I've always probably been like, let's say, an average-ish athlete. So for the most part, like I never looked at myself competing against everybody else or comparing against everybody else. At this age, I run because for me, it's probably the best way to kind of stay in shape as I'm getting older, if I want to eat things and kind of not get, you know, too bloated, let's say. So what I do is I have a spreadsheet that goes back 25, 30 years of every race that I've ever run. So I don't look at it and say, hey, can I win this race or can I beat so-and-so? I'm looking to compete against myself. So basically every time I do a 5K or a 10K, I'm like, okay, my last race, I ran the 5K in 32 minutes. Can I do this race in 31 and a half minutes? I don't care if everybody around me is doing it in 25 minutes. That's not realistic. We're all built differently and wired differently. So for me, I legitimately compete against myself, not against anybody else, because I mean, we're all different, you know?
That's awesome. That's really cool though.
Yeah, it definitely helps. And it's crazy too, looking at the spreadsheet now too, because I think it was something I started putting together about 10, 15 years ago. And weirdly, like every 5K I ever ran is like in some database, like on the web. So I spent probably a good 6 months searching every race I ever ran. Jeff Seltzer, Jeffrey Seltzer, whatever else like that, seeing what pops up. Oh, like, if that's my race. And then just, you know, populating a spreadsheet. Did the same thing for my wife. And then my kids started running races a few years ago, created a spreadsheet for them as well. So this way we can look at it and say, hey, what is this? What is that? How are we doing? It's just, again, as a data dork, this is what I love to do. So I like to kind of see how I can beat my last time, or, you know, I'll put a story next to it in terms of why I didn't beat the time. Like, hey, the weather was bad, or, you know, I wasn't feeling well, or whatever it was. So this way I can get other variables to understand, like, what's the optimal situation for myself when it comes to running.
That's really cool. You know what you should do is when you're finally done, you should like write like a small story or like a story about that. Like my journey tracking it.
I mean, it's funny you say that. It's like when I'm finally done might be when I'm dead, because like, to be honest, like it's something that, like, you know, as I get older, I think I can do it probably as I get older. I don't know when I'll actually be done racing or done running, especially as like my wife and I, my wife actually right now was down in Disney World to run the Disney Princess 10K. Cool. So like eventually in retirement, our plan is to live in the Disney World area and probably continue to do like Disney 5Ks and 10Ks. So I don't know that it will ever be done. But we did do, but a year or two ago, I'm not sure if you've ever heard about Storyworth. Have you heard of that before?
No, okay, I haven't.
So cheap plug for Storyworth in case anybody cares out there. Basically, it is a website subscription that you can get. And what you do is every week, somebody sends you like a topic, and you can write kind of like a chapter or a couple of paragraphs or pages about it. So what we did was a couple years ago, we gifted it to each other. So every week we would each send the other person kind of like a question or a topic. And then after a year, like 52 weeks, basically of, you know, one chapter or one topic per week, now we each have a book basically documenting things about our lives. It could be things like, hey, what are your thoughts about your parents from growing up? Or what was your first sporting event? Or, you know, tell me about the first time you thought you were in love, or whatever it was, right? And then at the end, you get a PDF, or you can pay to have like a hard copy printed out. So we have a couple of copies that every week we'd read about each other's experiences throughout life. You get to, you know, learn more about them. But then even more so, like we gave those books to our daughters as well, so they can kind of learn more about like, okay, these are our parents, but like they're real people, and these are kinds of things they've experienced throughout their lives. So it's a pretty neat concept. We'll probably do that again in about 5 or 10 years. But like for the first year that we did it, like it was amazing. Like we documented so much stuff, and especially as you get older, it's tougher to remember some things too. So it's great to kind of put it down on paper before it leaves our memory altogether.
That's really cool. I think I'm going to ask my wife to do that. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, you should check it out, and it's pretty cool too because like it'll give you some pre-populated or canned questions, but you can decide what questions to send the other person. You can create questions yourself. Like again, even like dumb questions like, "Hey, growing up, what was your favorite food?" Or "What restaurant did you like the most?" Or like, "Tell me about your first job out of college." Like all sorts of stuff. So it's really cool that it goes from like personal to professional to goofy to all sorts of stuff. So again, as obviously I'm married for over 20 years at this point. So it's a case of like, even though we're married for over 20 years, there are certain things that maybe you don't necessarily know about the other person's childhood or their life. So it's a great way again to like learn and bond with your plus one.
Awesome. That's cool.
Nice. So we do have a few minutes left. Wanted to get into one more topic that we teased earlier. So a few weeks ago on the podcast, when I had Marcus and Daniel on, we talked about Pokemon cards and about how I started going back to trading card shows. And while growing up, it was all basically baseball, basketball, football cards. Now these trading card shows are like half to 2/3 Pokemon cards, which just totally intrigues me. And I'm sure that Pokemon cards are the reason why some of these shows can even justify being open. So, Mark, I know you had mentioned that you've over the years collected Pokemon cards, you've bought them and stuff like that. So, can you tell me a little bit about like your experience with the collection?
So Pokemon for me has been a staple of my childhood. Growing up in the 90s, being in third grade when this kind of new RPG video game came out of the Game Boy, they had these red and blue cartridges. That alone was insanely innovative as a child. And over time, it was kind of this concoction of a really good video game, right? Pokemon Red and Blue are actually great RPGs. They had this TV show that they released at the same exact time. And then next came all these really cool trading cards. So it was like this multimedia blast of this new Japanese fad that essentially everyone bit into. And we all watched the show. We would play with the cards. These are actually my childhood cards from the 90s up here.
Oh, cool.
And it became this thing where everyone loved it. It was kind of becoming a foundation of 90 fads, right? Similar to a Tamagotchi.
Yep.
Over time, Pokemon started to fall off a little bit when the millennials started to get older, and like specifically the mid 2000s, late 2010s, or like late 2000s is when they fell off. So they started coming out with a new movie. There was a little bit of a rebirth. At some point, a lot of those millennials who got older had more and more money and wanted to get back into the hobby. So they started diving back in. But this phenomenon occurred where kids were loving it because there was new movies. There's all these new anime shows. There's all these new video games that come out. So they've successfully hooked onto a generation while simultaneously creating new content for the youngest generation for like 30 years. And it's interesting to think about because my kids love Pokemon. I've always loved it. Talking about grading cards and you get the perfect card and angle. I've sent a bunch of cards to PSA.
Yeah.
And it is a cutthroat world.
Right.
From your aside earlier, sometimes I send a card, you think it's an 8 or a 9. It could be pristine. I'm looking at that thing under my microscope, right? I feel like a scientist.
Yes.
And you get it back and it's like a 6. And it's
like,
okay.
Like I said earlier, I have some wire cutters and a screwdriver. I can help you ungrade some of those if you want and go raw again. If that helps.
You know what? And you know what it is? It's funny because I actually looked into the PSA process because I was really intrigued about what you were talking about earlier years ago.
Yeah.
And there is a person that sits down and grades it. Right. And guess what, Jeff? If that person has a bad day, your card might get a bad grade.
I think you had a bad day, right?
I've seen people crack open like a 6, send it back, and it'll get like an 8.
That's
and
crazy.
You're like, what? But
right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I've loved it, right? For me, I still enjoy it. I'm going to pass it all on to my kids. Like, I think it's fun. I still find joy from Pokemon, despite there now being like 950 more monsters than when I was a kid. Like,
right.
It's pretty crazy.
Nice. And then it was a few years ago, Pokemon Go was pretty big as well, where it was kind of like almost like a GPS game where you can find Pokemon or characters out in the wilderness, I guess. And if you followed the app, right?
Yeah, and it's funny too because if you think about Pokemon, you have to give that company credit because they've been pretty innovative, right? Like they had a little microphone on your N64 controller for "Hey You Pikachu." They had a lot of different types of games where you can trade and connect. Like I remember in '97 or '98 connecting and trading Pokemon with my friends. So they've always been able to capitalize on the innovation in kind of the app and game space. And I think just having that other area where it's like they have all the cards, they have all the merchandise, they have these new partnerships with Fendi that they had last year. I mean, people are going Poke crazy right now.
That's crazy. Yeah. Like I said, like I respect and I appreciate that people, I mean, for me, I'm a collector of all sorts of random nonsense. So who am I to judge people for collecting Pokemon cards? I mean, I collect wrestling action figures and wrestling cards and all sorts of just random nonsense. So to each his own, right? If it makes somebody happy and people get enjoyment out of it, I think it's amazing. It's great. And I think it's awesome. There's a whole industry and business around it. You know, for me, like I said a few weeks ago, I'm always just kind of, I guess, blown away in terms of how one values a Pokemon card. Because like my thought was like, hey, if I have an Aaron Judge rookie card, if Aaron Judge does well, by default, his card does well. But like from a Pokemon perspective, I get it's all supply and demand, because it's not like, hey, Pikachu had a great day, so the value of a Pikachu card goes up or something like that. Like it's not the same one-to-one, but again, I guess, you know, if it makes somebody happy and there's an interest in it, and also limited cards and stuff like that, that probably drives the price and demand up.
Yeah, it is. It is very much supply and demand. They have these competitions, and some of the biggest cards, it's like you have to sign up to some creative competition in Japan, and they only have 100 cards, and then they have a winner card. And then others, it's like, hey, you know, for Moonbreon, this card that I have that's worth like $1,500-$1,600.
Nice.
There's like 11,000 PSA 10s.
Jesus.
So really, like, why is the value so high if there's that many, right?
Yes.
And it becomes counterintuitive with some of the newer cards that have a high supply, and it makes more sense with some of the older cards.
Sure.
It's bizarre.
Absolutely. I don't know. I mean, again, especially when money's involved, you would hope there's some kind of true like quantifier that can drive up or down, because otherwise it's just open to, I guess, you know, nonsense or shenanigans. But it's a free market. It works how it's supposed to. And if, you know, I have a card that I think is worth $1,000 and you want to pay $1,000 for it, then it's worth $1,000. It's kind of how it works, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's economics. Cool. So we've said a lot. And again, Mark, I appreciate you coming on the show this week. Anything you want to plug or support or promote before we move on for the day?
No. I just wanted to say thank you all for listening to me. Give me a follow on Instagram. And yeah, I'd love to talk about technology. So let me know how I can help.
Awesome. So for those that don't know what Mark's Instagram is, it's at The Real Mandrews. That's The Real M. Andrews. Obviously, you can also follow Mark Andrews, the Baltimore Ravens tight end, if you'd like. Although after his last game, he has trouble catching balls in the 1 yard line. So maybe this is the better catcher out of the two of them. We'll have to see. Anyway, with that said, again, thank you everybody for joining this week. As always, the next few weeks, we have a lot of really awesome episodes once again coming up. I'm working on some cool things because I think they're cool. It's my podcast, so I guess that's how it works. I want to remind everybody that you can find the show on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod. My personal Instagram is at Seltzer77. If you have any business opportunities or something you want to send me, feel free to email the show directly at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. For all things Jeff Seltzer, you can find me over at jeffseltzer.com, which, as always, is the official sponsor of Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. Reminder also, tell your friends, your neighbors, anybody you want. The show is available on all podcast platforms. We are on YouTube at Everybody Has a Story Pod. We're on Spotify in video and audio. We are on all other platforms as well. With that said, have an amazing week, and I look forward to hearing from you guys throughout the week. Take care. Bye.